Perhaps you've heard of a way of playing tabletop role-playing games called campaign play, where you sit down with your friends and you convene every week, you look at each other across the table, and you resume the same story. You don't create new characters all the time, and instead you sustain something. This means that setbacks and successes can be that much richer. The party's starship could be destroyed, but perhaps they will become the rulers of entire planets, the saviors of the galaxy. And this is something different than one-shot play, where all of this conflict is handed to you and packed into a single session or a very short arc. It's something that's earned. But these campaigns, they aren't easy to bring together. Now, even among devoted hobbyists, when everyone's passionate about the game, a lot of things can go wrong. There are some pitfalls that I think are easily missed. And if you're going into things and you make these choices in the opposite direction, I think that it can be difficult to see how they may result in less than stellar results. So here are my axioms for successful campaign play.
Like this.
Now, a word of preface. This is going to be focused mostly on a social group, a group in meat space. It's something that you're going to include people from your family and your friends in because they're the people that you want to spend the most time with. This also means that there's going to be new players, returning players, and possibly folks for whom their interest in the hobby may be tangential, but that doesn't mean that they can't become great players in your campaign. There are many reasons why campaigns fail, but I find that centrifugal force and too steep of a learning curve or too much weight falling onto players and GMs too quickly are the reasons why. So let's break it down. My first point of advice, my first axiom, is to start at level 1, or to start at the bottom of the learning curve for these things. Not only because of the mechanical learning, the way that the GM is going to have to learn the weaknesses and strengths of the individual characters, but also for story reasons. You can develop patrons, teachers, mentors. This is when party members are going to need things like a horse, transportation, they're going to need their contacts. It's where relationships with the world are developed. And these relationships become less relevant as players grow in power. This can be very mechanical. Animal Messenger can circumvent the need to send a message by post, for example, or it can be more. It can be about how your vampire now has more dots in a discipline, or possibly is more connected to the prince and can get information without resorting to that icky thing called friendship. And then there's the reason of spontaneity. When you start at level 1, or at the bottom, you can have the influences of your fellow players, the inspiration of your game master, and the sort of story arc and content that he'd like to include influence the way your character develops. Now, lots of people write extensive backstories for level 1 characters, and I will point you to Aaron Dershadle's video advising against this. But suffice it to say, I believe that you should allow influences, both as the player and as the GM, to affect how you're designing things. This means that if you're playing a game that has kind of long arc builds, like Pathfinder, you can allow things that pop up in your path to change your mind. Say you find a +2 short sword very early on in an adventure, playing Pathfinder. This might make your monk move in a completely different direction towards weapon use, and it may mean that your grappling-focused monk, who may be set on a trajectory towards having a snake animal companion to assist his grapples, and so on, this might be something that you leave behind because there's this new story developing about a unique character. But the more that you're invested in these kind of unique mechanics, the more that you're invested in sort of a gimmicky way of combining the disciplines of Mage the Ascension or vampiric disciplines, the more that you're less likely to have the events that happen in play change your mind. And this could be story events, this could be a family member dying, this could be a new villain rising and coloring your character's perception of the world. So, start at the beginning. Should be simple enough. This means that you have to embrace the challenges of lower level play. You have to embrace greater probabilities of failure on skill checks in a game like GURPS, for example. And it means that combat has a different contour if you're playing something like Pathfinder. And it may mean that combat is almost out of the question in something like Hunter the Reckoning, because the players have to sort of cultivate their knowledge of the supernatural. But you're going to have much more fun and have more relationships with NPCs and the world that will inform the story and help it keep going later. This is paramount. The next piece of advice that I have is to put your foot down in session 0 about how wide the field of ideas is going to be. I think that there's a lack of cohesion in a lot of games, and this can mean having humans only to begin with in a Burning Wheel or a Harn game. That's my rule. Later on, if a new player or a new character comes into the story as the players pass the Shava forest where the elves abide, then sure, perhaps an elf can arrive. In a traditional high fantasy setting, this can mean curtailing things down to the smaller panoply of races that are traditionally found in the player's handbook, and keeping things like catfolk and kenku at bay. Now, I know these can be very compelling options for some players, but I put it to you that the more different races that are there in the party, the harder it will be for the game master to develop backstories and relationships for the characters in the party. The more that there are similar races, the more that it's easier to have an NPC arrive that cares about what race your character is. This can mean that if there are 2 elves in the party, perhaps there will be a long-term relationship with an elf, and the game master can drop that in. It is that much more difficult because quests often relate to the greater human world. This is where the incentives for things like lordships and gold pieces are something that's less relevant to strange extraplanar beings whose motivations are otherworldly. You can have a holy person, you can have a debauched child of hell, but written on their character sheet it could just be human. And there's another thing that you have to put your foot down, I think, as you convene a campaign. And it's about the number of players. It's about the number of people that you need to be at the session minimally to make things work. And it also means the too many people, the point where your ability to balance things at the game master, the ability of the hosting site to really manage more people, cracks. I've talked about how in Shadowrun I think the mechanics can really only support about 3 players before too many dice are flying in too many different directions. And in a game like 5th edition, it could be 5 or 6 players. And in a game like Pathfinder, I think the ideal is about 4, and it can manage 5 and get by with 3. So keep that in mind. The bigger the game, the more stories there are, pulling in different directions. And this goes for things like Fate or World of Darkness just as well. You need to know your limits, and it's often based on how much time you have for your sessions. That's going to be the driving force around how many people it's possible to have at the table. And at the same time, if you need more people, you need to keep after that. You need to keep the players interested in asking their friends as attrition comes into play. You need to keep yourself interested in the internet and kind of looking out for new people to join the campaign. The way that new people will join the campaign, the mechanics of kind of how they will get items and so on, is something to discuss with the players that are there at the beginning of the game so that everyone's on board. I've seen too many cases of where a new character kind of gets a sweetheart deal. They get to shop around for their magic items and get a really optimal combination in a way that the players that have been there slogging through the mud and looting the dungeon don't. And this can really cause some issues. And my final axiom here is to keep up with the administrative details. If you need to kind of give out treasure, then you need to do it in a way that is going to not slow down your game. I've seen sessions bogged down with shopping trips. I've seen people leafing through the books for new options and leveling up in a way that leaves too much hang time. If you're playing less than weekly, it's that much more acute. So this means that if you are a player, find times with your fellow players away from the session where you can talk about mechanics and strategizing how you're going to level up or make new buys. If this is a story game, that still means the character development is something interesting to discuss with each other. Know where your characters are going before you sit down at the table, because that sort of hang time, that sort of planning time, is something that eats away at how much time you have to play the game. And the less time you're playing the game, the more that things like drinking, dancing, and playing video games become more attractive options, and tabletop role-playing becomes something that people will reconsider whether it's worth the costs. Now, I love this hobby, and I want to see it grow. And so this is why I'm putting together this set of sort of pitfalls, these sort of preconceptions. Why do people want to start at higher than level 1? I think it's because they've had negative experiences or they've done it too many times, and I understand that completely. But I also think that it may be that there's a rush to kind of get into the goodies. But like I said, you really drop that opportunity to have the mechanics in conversation with the story. It's the most gamist thing you can ever do. I think the game is something useful, something that motivates cool decisions that are in character. And that's why I consider myself to be something of a gamist. But don't go too far in that direction. And that's why I don't think you should start with higher generation vampires or higher level characters. The other pieces of advice here about too many people at the table and about making sure to keep up with the details, they're important. I put this video together because I find that I need a preface to creating more video that people will look for in YouTube. I want to make more videos about classes and races, about unique situations in the story, like fighting a dragon or, say, unearthing a Methuselah if you're playing vampire. And I want to talk about these specifics because I think there's something that people Google, and I want this channel to grow and be a bigger conversation between more people. I am going to make some more Traveler content coming up here. I want to make something that surveys the alien races, perhaps surveys the geography of the Third Imperium. Let me know your own thoughts on kind of more interesting specific videos that you'd like, because these general things are only the introduction to the Complex Games Apologist. Thanks.
Thank you for checking out my channel. If you enjoyed what you've seen here, maybe check out one of my in-depth video essays on topics in the tabletop gaming world, or subscribe with alerts so that you get updated anytime I put up new content here on YouTube. And above all, let me know what you think about this topic and about my videos in general by leaving a like or a dislike, and especially your own opinions in the comments below.